Good afternoon. My name is Beth Marsh, and I am the Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement with the Organization of American Historians. Welcome to Crafting a Successful Journal article, the first in this year's OAH Professional Development webinar series. The Organization of American Historians is located on the campus of Indiana University Bloomington. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Steve Andrews. Steve is the interim executive editor of the Journal of American History and an adjunct professor of history at Indiana University. He is also an editor at Process, a blog for American history, and the consulting editor of The American Historian. His work and teaching focuses on the cultural and religious history of the United States, and he has taught classes on religion, reform, and the Civil War. He is deeply engaged in public history, appearing in the media to discuss the history of conspiracy theories and working closely with the 9/11 Museum in New York City to help educators address conspiracy theories in the classroom. Steve, thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm going to share my screen and get started. All right, so thank you guys so much for joining me. My name is Steve Andrews. I have been at the Journal of American History in some capacity for about 20 years, reading in manuscripts. I've read thousands of them, probably nearly 4,000 so far. And so I want to talk a little bit about today about things that I've seen that we often see when we get submissions, things that are issues of why things don't get published, because it's not really because of craft. Many of the pieces we get are very well written, they're well researched, they have good sources, and so why aren't they get in? It's not status, because at the Journal we read triple blind, so we I don't know, the inside editors don't know who the authors are, the readers don't know who the authors are, and the authors don't know who the readers are. But sometimes these are issues of structure, of focus, of argument. Many of us have pieces that are written for some other purpose that we try to purpose. This is particularly for historians. People in associated fields in the social sciences may have some similar things, but are really working with how historians are trained. We're trained to write seminar papers and dissertations, and oftentimes either as graduate students with seminar papers or after we're graduate students and we write a dissertation, we want to turn some of those dissertation chapters into articles. But it's not simple to necessarily turn things into articles. So I have my slides are fairly boring. They're also here so that people, if there's things that I go over because I'm talking, that people can look at the slides and read them. I'm happy to answer any questions along the way. Beth will let me know if there's things I need to answer. But one question is, why do we write articles in the first place? And I'm I know that historians, history is largely a book field, so it's not as if people write books to get promotions, and articles count, but they don't count the same depending on the kind of institution you're at. But I really do think there are reasons to write articles, and that sometimes the conception we have of them minimizes their importance. They allow your work to be seen widely. We have things that are on JOH that are read by, in some cases, downloaded by more than 100,000 people. Certainly we have multiple articles that are in tens of thousands, and that is just a lot more eyes who are going to be on your work than if you publish a book, for most books. It allows your work to be used more widely. Sometimes books, particularly in academic presses, are priced out of the market for many people. They can't be assigned in classes depending on how classes are organized, but articles can easily be shared and read and used in more places. There's also a very sustained feedback on composition and argument for an article that doesn't always come for the book, in that the number of readers that you will have in an article at the JH, when you get 4 readers on a first submissions and then a reread, you're going to get 6 or 7. By the time you're done, and then it goes through copy editing and looking at sources and spot checking, you'll have had 8 or 10 people respond constructively to your work. Articles can also be produced more quickly. Not super quickly, this is history after all, but they can be more quickly produced than monographs. And there's also a need to publish, right? So there is a need to get your work out there to be a productive scholar, and articles are a good way to do it. The best way to do an article, of course, is probably to start with an argument, then build that argument out for the evidence base to make the case, and build with an argument that provides the structure and the rationale. That's what you would like to do with an article, but sometimes that's not what you have. You have many cases, you have a body of research that you've done. You've been pursuing a question or a topic that may not be narrowly driven by an argument, but you want to produce it into an article. And how do you turn that into an article? Though the best way would be that the argument leads from the beginning, determining the structure. That's not always what happens. Sometimes you have a long narrative that there is an argument in there, but how to make it pop, how to make it work in an article length piece of work. And it's important to understand the differences between a lot of the writing that we do and what an article is, right? So as we write, as particularly history, and again, other fields might be slightly different, but as we work in history, there are a lot of goals from graduate writing that are not necessarily always simply pushing and making an argument in a discrete package of an article, right? We write to show mastery and professional competence, to get a grade, to get our dissertation done, to show your professor or a reader the work you've done, to understand a particular field or subject. You want to demonstrate craft. And a good paper that you write, a seminar paper or even a dissertation, can show all kinds of things. It can show craft, it can show research, it can show where you visited, the amount of time you've done, your mastery of a field, all of these kinds of things. And all of those things are part of an article, but they don't necessarily make an article. And you can have all of those things and really not have an article when you're done. You've done a lot for this work. It's done things for you, but it hasn't necessarily done what an article does. Because when you write an article, and when we receive an article at the JH or we send it out to our readers, by and large, the readers assume those things, right? They don't know who you are. They are not evaluating necessarily the kind of arc of scholarship you've made, of whether you deserve an A or deserve your degree. Instead, they assume a lot of these things. So when you attempt to prove them in an article, in some ways you're distracting from what an article is really doing. So if we need a definition for a monographic historical, I use this: a self-contained piece of writing that presents evidence to make an original argument set within a discrete historical and historiographic context. Now, that may seem very simple and that almost everything that people do fits this, but not always, because some of the words here that are really important are self-contained, and sometimes pieces aren't, that it's making an original argument and that it's set within a discrete historical and historiographic context. So let me say a little bit about the origin story of many articles, right? There are articles that we write as historians that are coming out of something else. You've written something for another purpose, or you've written something and you're now turning it into, you're essentially retro editing into an article. And I think that's legitimate. I don't think we should say, because something starts this way, it can't become an article. I think that there are, within all of the work that we do, there are articles to be made, articles to be written that don't always come about. So sometimes articles have essentially a dissertation prospectus model. That is, someone has written a dissertation, they want to make an article out of it. So rather than excising something or making a particular argument, what they do is they make a miniature version of their dissertation, right? So they attempt to cover what they cover in maybe 300 pages in 40 pages, 30 pages. And that runs into some of those problems of it's not discrete, it doesn't move in all those directions, it's not pursuing a single article. Now, you can write something like this that works, but oftentimes they don't. The other is the dissertation chapter model, where you have 5 chapters in your dissertation, and you decide to take one of those and make it an article. But unless your dissertation is crafted in a very particular way, those chapters don't sit on their own as a kind of fractal of the entire argument. Sometimes you have a dissertation that makes a very discrete argument from point A to point B, but it's often very clear to a reader that this piece is a part of a much larger piece, and that it doesn't necessarily make an argument on its own. And then you have the produce work to satisfy a requirements model, which is that you have a piece that you wrote for some other purpose. It's not really constructed as an article, not really constructed in that way, but you're going to send this in. So there are ways in which we have done writing that are proto articles. They could become articles, but they're not yet articles. So, so what can you do? You have pieces of writing in many cases, or you're about to start something, that you're about to write something. So how do you write something that's going to get published, that's going to appeal to readers, that's going to make sense and function as an article? You want to do this, obviously, in a brutal job market. We want to be able to publish. You want to set yourself apart. You want to put it in the best journal, though I put that seriously in quotes, because I think lots of journals are doing very good work, and that because a journal's scope might be slightly narrow than the AHR or the JH or William and Mary, doesn't mean that it's not doing top quality scholarship. It's just focused in another area. So where to put something and how to place it is something that you can do. You can make those kinds of decisions about, and it's not necessarily what best is. Best is really the best match for the argument that you're making. So how do you choose? How do you make these decisions? And what the real thing you want to do is you want to be guided by the argument you're making, by the context you're setting as to where these things should appear. So since you can only place each article once, how do you make that decision? So even pieces that were not originally constructed as an article, they either are part of something else, they were written for some other purpose, can be turned into and can be retrofitted into an article. But it really requires, and this is one of the strongest things that it's important to say to people who are thinking about writing an article or thinking about turning something into an article, is to really be honest about what the piece is, about what it does. How is it constructed? How does it work? What are the arguments it's making? How is those things put together? And then how does it work for its possibilities of publication? And one of those questions is, what is the engine of the piece? And this is something that as an editor that I'm constantly thinking about as I'm reading this, which is, what is the engine that's driving this thing to be? What is the engine that's behind this article? Not necessarily what is the argument, that's part of it, but what is the thing that's pushing this article to exist? What is the thing that's driving it? And part of that's intellectual aspiration. What does the piece think it's doing? And part of it's its origin story. Where do we see where this came from? How did it come about? How does this piece see itself? And this is often an important disjuncture between articles that are really successful and articles that aren't, is a kind of honesty and understanding that's written with understanding what this engine is. So here are a couple of engines that we have from these kinds of pieces, right? So one is, I found this new thing. Here's this new thing I found. And this can be where a lot of historical scholarship comes from. I found a new source. And this new source has never been seen before, and I'm exploring what's in this source. And that can be really valuable. So none of these engines are necessarily making a successful article versus an unsuccessful article. They're just making an argument of what kind of article it's going to be, right? And so you can imagine, say, Midwife's Tale, right? We found Martha Ballard's diary that's telling us this story that we didn't know. We have this new window in, and it's a fabulous book, obviously. So there's all kinds of places in which you can find, but there's this new source that's at the core of a piece. Or I found a new way to do a thing that we've done before, but this new thing does it differently. And that can be GIS. It can be new mapping software. It can be word clouds. It can be a new theory. It can be a disciplinary borrowing. I'm going to write a Foucauldian study of blank, or I found out that people in sociology have this particular method, and I'm going to bring it in to look at the Black freedom struggle in Mobile. Whatever it's going to be, you're borrowing something, you have this new method. It's not necessarily that you're looking at a new place or something that's never been studied, or that you have a new source that we've never seen, but instead you're bringing an argument from somewhere else. You see this, and this has been a lot of of pieces that we've gotten at the journal, which is I put a word word into a search engine. It now is doing a deep data search and tracing out where a particular term, liberty, freedom, capitalism, whatever, has been. And I will now put together how this term has appeared. And there's a number of sources like this. And again, not to say that that can't be very good research, but that it is very clearly the technology that is driving the argument, right? So then you have, I'm doing an old thing in a new place, which is that we've looked at, say, labor strikes in Detroit, and now I'm looking at them in a new city. Or I'm writing a similar story to X, but in a new time or place. So I'm looking at something that someone else has studied, but doing it in a new place. So if you imagine about the small town studies that were looking at various places in New England, you have someone has looked at Chatham, but now I'm looking at Andover, and someone did Andover, but now I'm going to do Dedham. This idea of you've seen this before, we're putting it in a new place, and that in a sense is making it new. So I'm looking at something that we are familiar with, but seeing whether the context changes it. I'm looking at a new set of people and a place that other people have written about. In some cases, we're looking at let's say a group of immigrants that has gone to St. Paul that someone hasn't studied before. That there have been other pieces looking at Italians in St. Louis or wherever, but this is going to look at a group in a new place. And again, the important thing is to recognize that this is the thing that you're doing that's new. This is the thing that is driving this narrative. And there are a bunch of them, right? So there are pieces, and you may think of your own work or work that you've read that really kind of falls into this, right? So part of is the rescue mission. Have you heard of X? You should have, but she or he has forgotten, or X was the first person to Y. These are other arguments in which you begin to see, and on this page, you get to see some of the historiographical nature come to the fore, right? So there are pieces that are very much dedicated with their newness being X said Y. I do not think that's completely right. I think Y needs to add in elements of A. So one of these issues is kind of a historiographical fight in which you say that someone else has studied this, but now you're looking at it and it is pitched in the early pages of an article as a corrective for earlier scholarship, or a corrective that something was bad or good, it was actually worse or better, or periodization, something started earlier or ended later. And then you, of course, I like this subject. I had to write a dissertation, so I wrote one. Here's a piece of it. So you get the kind of, I have a narrative. The narrative is good. It's incredibly well crafted. It uses good sources. The characters are interesting. It's well written. But the analytical nature is kind of trailing behind. So as you think of these engines, I would like you to be thinking of the question of, are these big questions, big frames, or small frames? One of the issues of a historiographical frame, for example, just to pick one out of this, is the idea of once you set something as primarily a historiographical corrective, you are making the audience only or mainly, it doesn't have to be, maybe you can branch out, but the downside, the danger is that you're making it to only appeal to people who are already interested in that scholarship. If you were doing a corrective that George Kennan, 20th century diplomat, was misunderstood because of X, essentially if someone does colonial history or they do 20th century, late 20th century popular culture and don't have a stake in the George Kennan, was he good or better, or was he different than we thought before, you're limiting your audience, right? So that might be a piece that, even if it's incredibly well crafted, couldn't go in the JH or the AHR, or instead is more meant for a more narrowly structured journal. Now, you can write about George Kennan and make an argument that appeals, that's very, very broad. The frame is big, but you need to think about what frame are you putting your work in as you're putting it there. So if you find a new source, that new source probably, depending on what it is, I mean, there are a lot of kinds of questions, but the new source on its own does not generally make an argument for the importance of an article appearing somewhere. It could, but you have to make that case, right? And again, Jacqueline Dowd Hall's piece on the long civil rights movement is one of the most popular pieces published in the JH in the last 30 years. And it is a largely historiographical corrective, but one that is very large as far as making a case about the civil rights movement that has wide interest, and the way that it's written opens outward to a broad readership. But again, there can be traps. And analyzing a new piece or making it primarily a historiographical argument, or someone did this for Detroit, I'm now doing it in Dearborn, could be interesting. But unless the argument is really made for how broad that frame is, that sense of the narrative of the newness being I'm doing it in a new place means that it comes out as a very narrow argument. Doesn't have to be, but it could be too narrow for many publications. And it may deserve an A, it may be wonderfully crafted, but it just may be too narrow in its argument to have a broad popular audience. And it also runs into the so what question. And this is something that runs through a lot of conversations about articles, which is, we knew it about Detroit. Why do we need to know it about Dearborn? Now, the value of historical people and their experience should always be cherished, and it's important that these people lived in their experiences. But for making an argument for the analytical edge of an article, you need to answer this question of so what? Why does someone who's not interested in Michigan or the labor movement or Dearborn, why do they need to know about this? And again, it might be that the piece you've crafted is incredibly well written, it's well done, it's well researched, and it's just not very broad. It's cast fairly narrowly. That's still valuable scholarship and probably can be placed somewhere. And like modern jets, many articles have multiple engines. So it's not always that it's just one of these things. You may have a new source that reveals a forgotten historical actor or reveals an understudied event. So you may have all of these things going, right? So as we kind of said, a newly discovered diary of a leader of a largely unknown strike in an auto plant in Dearborn, Michigan in 1934 might bring a lot of these things together. But the challenge as an author is to say, when I'm taking this to the reader, what am I flagging to them about what they need to know is new about this? Is it that we have this diary of a leader? Well, do we need to know about that? What does it reveal? Is it about that this strike was unknown? Was it unknown because there were lots of strikes and this one just hasn't gotten scholarly attention? Again, could be valuable, but you might be limiting the scope of how big that argument is. So you want to be very clear as you compose this about what you think are the factors that are really driving the argument and the originality of the piece that you're putting together. And this question of newness is one that is often obsessive to the level of fetishizing in historical scholarship. And it's important, right? One of the main things we ask when we send out someone to evaluate an article for the JH is it original? And originality is important. But the degree of originality and how that originality works is it's sometimes accumulation. And sometimes it's a little new and it's adding a piece to a puzzle. It's adding a part of a mosaic. It isn't shocking or profound, but it's still valuable and publishable. Depending on where and how big the argument you're making can determine where it's publishable, but it's still valuable. But you need to know the piece's engine to let you know where you should submit it. Because the question about getting accepted or rejected at the JH or any journal is oftentimes not about the quality of the scholarship or the quality of the research or the quality of the writing. It's about the size of the argument. So it's not about whether it should be published. There's lots of things that we reject that should be published, but where? And one of the tendencies of authors that gets in their way is to see existing scholarship as the enemy of your piece. I really think the literature is your friend. I think all of us as graduate students had that feeling, or even early career scholars had that feeling of going to the library and discovering that there was a book on your topic, or that you find out that somebody at another university is writing a dissertation on your topic, and now do you need to change? And I think there's a kind of a need to carve out that what you're doing is wholly new. And a lot of times this need to do that, or the tendency to want to do that as part of a literature review, trips off the readers and makes them very angry that the author's created a straw man, that the author is misrepresenting the literature to claim that no one has examined blank or no one has examined this, when it's clear that someone has. There's no reason to claim that no one has examined something just to make room for your piece, for room for your argument. You want it to be new, but your argument needs to be new. If the only thing new about your the piece you're writing is no one has looked at Dearborn, and that's the only part that's new, then your piece is very small. Now, small pieces are valuable, but that newness that no one has looked at Dearborn is only a part of what your argument. You have not applied your analytical skills to this topic, and so what you're producing is inherently new. So I would rather and suggest that you don't see the previous work as antagonistic, as it's stealing your thunder, as you have to imagine that you have to have this widely cleared area that you can do your intellectual work in. Instead, I would rather see that when people are making arguments that come into what you want to argue, it's not taking away from what you're doing, it's enhancing it, it's sharpening it. That someone else who has made arguments about this thing or that thing that's a part of your argument is giving you something to work against. It proves that other people have found this topic interesting. It proves that other people have found this topic important. It proves that there's a conversation happening somewhere. So in your literature review and talking about that, as you position your piece, don't feel the need that because someone else has been in this space that there's nothing for you to say. And as you do your notes, and this is it may seem strange because it's important to do notes, right? It's important to locate your work. It's important to locate your scholarship, important for you to show that you're familiar with the field. But avoid the temptation to use your notes to establish yourself and your right to speak by giving long lists of discursive footnotes or long lists of things that you've read. Now, there are times to produce those lists. Those are important parts, but you need to be very careful. You want to show that you understand the argument and where your argument fits, but you don't need to make the case that you've read all of the important books. As reviewers of our articles will say, they grant that to you. They grant that when they get your anonymized article that you are a person in the profession. And unless there's something glaring there that says, why didn't they talk about blank? Why didn't they say this? Or you seem like you don't understand what's happening, they're going to grant your right to speak. You need to show, you need to show what works you're engaging. You don't want to fall into the temptation of doing a full historiographic article inside of your article before you talk about it. Because at some point, you will want to make this argument about this article about your argument. There's also a danger that the standard model that I see every day in articles that we receive is vignette, literature review, thesis. But the problem is if the literature review is going to go on for 10 pages, your thesis doesn't wind up until page 10, that people have been reading and you're giving them the background of what other people have said, and you don't get to what you are saying until very deep into the manuscript. That's way too late. So as you're picking what you need, what sources you need to present, how you present the literature, don't present all of the literature that weighs on your subject. Only present the stuff that weighs on your argument. Which of this literature that you're engaging with are you actually analytically engaging with? Now, there may be notes where you say, of course, I've read this, this, and this, but get through that quickly. Your readers are going to assume you know the subject, but you need to show you control the historical context and stakes of your argument. Because this, and I want to give this again and again as we go through this, the important thing you want to demonstrate is that you know what your argument is doing. You want to set the stakes. And this means that you are making an argument for why this argument's important and how big of a frame you're setting your argument into. This is what you want to do. This is where you really want to state it boldly. I mean, if you're writing your drafts, feel free to prevaricate, to use weasel words. It may be, it should be, it could be, it possibly is indicated that. But as you move forward, you want to refine these. Now, again, you don't want to overstate, and this is a very narrow window, but you want to give the clearest thesis you can as early in the piece as you can, followed by a statement of the stakes. Even if it doesn't work this way in your draft, you want to do it more artistically, more better written. I argue X, this is important because of Y. You really want to get this out. You don't want to overstate it, but you want to state it as boldly as you can and make the case of why people need to know what you're looking at. What are you doing that's original? What are you doing that is new? What is the frame that you're putting it into and why people should care about it? And this is a central tension that we have, particularly at a big general academic journal like the JH, which is the arguments have to be fairly broad and, at least in our minds, appeal to everyone or a broad segment of practitioners who study the history of the United States. So you want to make an argument that's supported by your evidence. And the concern is sometimes if readers challenge that the argument goes too far, there's a concern that if you pull it back all the way to only fit the letter of your evidence, that it will be so narrow, it will be unpublishable. And it runs into the so what question. So you've got to weigh these two things, both of recognizing what the data allows you to say with 100% certainty, and then where you can go beyond it to make an argument that pushes beyond what you know of the evidence. And this is an important thing, which is to recognize what you can argue and what you can't, because the title of your argument, the title of a piece is not an argument. A title can't be aspirational. The title is a promise. And it's a risk. If your title says something that you don't deliver, then the readers begin to think that you don't know what you're actually writing. For example, if your title is Cities of Crisis, Race and Urban America in the Age of Revolutions, but your sources are newspapers from Philadelphia from 1788 to 1790, you may have a problem. Now, you don't necessarily have a problem. You can make a case that 88 to 90 are the important years to understand race and urban America. You could make the argument that Philadelphia is either unique but needs to be understood to understand how race worked in an urban context, or that it's typical of other cities. It's typical of what's happening in other places that would fall into this rubric of urban America. But you can't simply state this as your title, assume that whatever you're saying about Philadelphia is either representative or not representative or crucial to understand what's happening in all of the United States, particularly with sectional differences and all of these kinds of things, right? The argument's there to be made. You can make that argument, but you have to make it. There's a lot of pieces, for example, that assume that because they're writing about New York City, they're writing about America. But these claims have to be limited. Now, you can say, is this, you limit this by saying that what I'm actually writing about is the urban north, or I'm writing about, coastal cities, or I'm writing about the middle states. There's all kinds of ways you can do it, but you have to take on that challenge of not simply presenting information and thinking it makes a bigger argument than it makes. You want to make the readers understand that you understand your evidence, especially its limitations. That you're writing about Philadelphia, and you know that Philadelphia isn't every city in the United States, north and south. But you think this says bigger things about urban America, that there are lessons you can take from it. But you can't assert that. You have to make that case. Readers might reject it. Readers might say, I don't think that Philadelphia tells us anything about Boston, and the cases are too different. But you have to at least make the case that you recognize that that criticism is out there. But here's why you think that Philadelphia is a great lens for understanding this question. Precise arguments are always better than vague assertions. A piece gets infinitely stronger when you make it clear to the reader where you're going beyond the evidence. It is your job to, in some ways, as a historian, go beyond the evidence, to go beyond you're not simply dictating what's the written word that you've gotten, you've assembled it and you're making an argument. And that's great. That's your job. But acknowledge those limitations in the evidence, blank spots, lacunae, things that are missing, things you wish you had, but then make the case of why you think you can make the argument anyway. Don't run away from the gaps. Don't run away from the weaknesses. Readers will often see them, and your piece, when you say, I understand that people might have this issue, but here's why I think we should go beyond it. Because one of the problems is that much of our work is often narrative, and that's great. I mean, narrative history is wonderful. But in an article, sometimes the writers obviously know that they need an analysis, they need an analytical angle, but that analytical angle is added afterwards, and it's only in the introduction and only in the conclusion. Or sometimes they want to make an analytical context. They have a particular story, a narrative that they're telling, and they say, this tells us really something about state building in early national period, or the carceral state, or something else. But those issues of the carceral state, or how it makes that how it represents that, only comes in the opening and the closing section. And in the center is a discrete narrative that doesn't necessarily seem to connect with those arguments. That is a real problem. That is a real problem, in which that the origin story of this piece, that it is not the argument is guiding the narrative, but that the narrative exists, but the narrative feels too small on its own as a narrative. So I've got to put some argument on either side, is a real problem that has to be addressed. This is one of the real challenges when you take a piece that existed in some other form and want to turn it into an article. The argument is that you say, well, this tells us something about the carceral state, and you give a little bit of carceral state in the beginning and a little bit at the conclusion to make that case. But in the center, the carceral state kind of disappears. That's a real problem with this kind of trying to marry an historical narrative with an analytical edge. So I want to talk a little bit about a potential piece and issues that the author faced, or that you can face thinking about it. It's just Pages of Rage. An author looking at largely unknown racist novelettes and paperbacks published in the South in the early 20th century between 1898 and 1920. So you have these sources. This is your engine, right? This is a new set of sources, largely unexamined, largely look unknown, that tell us this story. And how do they approach this? What argument can you make? What are the various literatures that can be reviewed? What does the piece need? What is the context of the argument rather than the subject? So if you're looking at this, you can imagine an entire set of possible literatures in which to place this, frames in which to place this, and here's just a few, right? You could imagine reading a piece like this, and if this was a dissertation, it might cover all of these things, right? You've got these particular books, and so you're going to tell the reader the history of the South, history of racial violence and Jim Crow, the history of the Reborn Klan, right? Because it's right in the midst of this period, the history of US publishing, even broader, history of book publishing, history of reading and literacy. Do we need to explain how widely books are circulating and how widely they're read? Maybe. Literature on the impact of reading and popular culture. What about capsule biographies of the authors of these books, or the history of these publishing houses? But you can see, and I'm not sure you can imagine, that as you pick certain ones of these, the argument gets easier. It's easier to imagine writing the biographies of these authors, the history of these publishing houses, when they published, what years. But at that point, you're writing a piece that is limiting itself in some ways. Now, again, you can take any of these topics and write an article that would win a ton of prizes and be great. But sometimes if you're taking it and you're saying, this is part of the history of the book, history of US publishing, rather than say a history of racial violence, you're talking about, you're appealing to different audiences. There are audiences who would be very interested in this if these books are used in this way about racial violence, and less interested or differently interested if this is a history of literacy. Now, both things can be important, but you might be targeting different groups of readers. In this case, let's say that they decide to argue, the author argues that these books had a profound effect on intensifying racial attitudes in the South. They contend these books intensified the racist feelings of readers and led to greater violence. This is a big, interesting claim. Depending on exactly how strongly you make this causal claim, you could be making the argument that without these books that existed in particular times and regions, or publication of these books lead to outbreaks of violence, you really could be making a very big, impressive argument that ties into all kinds of questions about the impact of popular culture and how it changes behavior. But if you imagine if this piece, in which the author describes the racial attitudes of the South, history of small publishing houses, an emergence of cheap paperbacks, and then the history of racial violence, but if the piece largely features long, close readings of these obscure and horrifying books, do you have a problem? And this is one of the issues that we see a lot of times in articles that are submitted, is that the argument is one that's very broad, very wide open, could be incredibly important, incredibly interesting, very problematic, but fascinating. But then the article that lays behind it is, say, in this case, a textual analysis. And the problem is that you are structuring a textual analysis about what you're saying is a behavioral causal factor, right? In this case, the engine is the newness of the books. They're a new source that can be used in all kinds of ways. There's arguments you can make with them. There's arguments you can make about them. But in this case, you can't do an argument that these books influenced people's behavior without having the people who are reading the books in the text. You can imagine the kinds of questions you'd have to ask and the sources you'd need to make that case. But the sources that you need to make that case are not textual analysis of the books themselves. Those might be fascinating. They might make a different argument, more textual analysis, or an argument that would be different than the argument that you're making. But if the argument you're making is these books created more violence, and you need to then see the violence that these books created and see them in the hands and minds of the audience that's reading them. So this is a lesson. And again, this idea is kind of built together of several different submissions that we've gotten that are making similar kinds of arguments, which is the argument needs to set the structure. You set the argument. In this case, in this kind of theoretical case, the author has created an argument that is big and causal, but in the core of the piece, it's more of a textual analysis. And so the argument size of the way the argument works and the analysis itself are not necessarily working together. And you set the stakes of this argument. And you have to decide the argument you're going to make, the frame you're going to set it into, and then the journal that is right to publish something that is that frame. So this is now a little bit of practical stuff about journal publication. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, but also just a little bit about where to submit and then how to respond to the responses you get. So you need to know, so we have a question here, which is, I'm cutting material from a lengthy book manuscript. If you create an article from the details, etc., submit the article. Yeah, so this is a question we get actually quite a bit, which is, can you submit a book that is, doing some of the things that you're doing in an article? Yes, depending on how different they are. If you're talking about the JAH, then it's an argument that you can have, as long as it's not exactly the same, it's covering the same material, then it's probably okay. It depends on how closely it is. If it's essentially excised, you're taking parts out of your book and you're publishing it as an article, probably don't want that. But we have even had cases like that. As long as the article appears before the book, we're usually fine with it. We want to be the place of first publication for those kinds of things. So where to submit? You should know the journal. You should be looking at your journals in your field and know the arguments that are the forefront. But this is the kind of question that I often get at the OAH meeting, which is a kind of game theory analysis that my journal or some other journal either wants things on a particular subject because they've already published on that subject, or they don't want pieces on that subject because they published on that subject. So that's already been covered, so you don't want to do it. And I don't think either one of those are true. We published a special issue on the carceral state, which we're very proud to publish. We then received a bunch of pieces about the carceral state. We published many of them, and they're excellent. And if they're excellent, we want them. Publishing on the carceral state was not necessarily saying, send us all your carceral state, that we were great to get it because it's fabulous scholarship, or saying, don't send it because we covered it already. Neither one of those things are a good guide. I think if something's appeared in a journal, they're interested in it. But I think there's lots of things that we don't get that I would love to get. And I tend to see the JHs, I'd love to see more things, more Caribbean history, more international history. We're getting more of that, but there are things that we don't have in the journal simply because we haven't received submissions on them, but we'd love to get them. As you're thinking about where you're going to publish, you can go from the broadest to the most specialized, but the real question is going to be the structure of your argument you have. How big is the argument you're making? Is your argument making really addressed to people who do labor history, or people who do the history of Michigan, or history of strikes? In that case, then you find someplace that does that, but go to the broadest one that you can find. When you send in to us, we will send out your piece to readers, and they will write reports, and we will send it back to you. This is when I correspond with the authors most. I don't know who the authors are till very, very late in the submission process. I don't particularly have any interest in knowing who they are. I don't want it to affect my evaluation. But later on, I often talk to authors when they get the reports and this reader was unfair and what they said was I didn't like, and I don't think I can do it. But all of this feedback, even brutal feedback, is very good for you in your scholarship, even though it can be soul crushing or depressing. The greatest compliment that an academic can get is someone to engage substantively with their work and then take time to give you their thoughts on it, even if those thoughts are negative. Most of the readers' reports you will get will be collegial and helpful, written with shared enterprise, and often very, very kind. Some you may get might be people that you hope never to interact with or have as colleagues. But the important thing is recognizing the content of this criticism from its presentation. In this, the starker, more brutally honest the criticism is, the better it is for you. It is important to get that criticism and that critical feedback now, even though I know it is awful to get and it is brutal to read it. But this is really important. Do not be defeated by criticism, and be open to think of whether what they are pointing out might be a necessary scope. In other words, if they say it's not broad enough for this journal or that journal, are they right? If so, then what they might be saying is, this is an excellent piece. However, it's constructed, and we've talked a little bit about the kind of frames and engines that you have. It's structured in a way that it just would be a better fit someplace else. In that case, maybe they're right. Now, if they're not right, if you think that, oh, that was an error of me overly weighting parts of the historiographical analysis in the beginning, but that's not the argument I want to make, well, now you have a good idea on how to fix it. If they give you criticism of argumentation, not of scope, but of argumentation, which is it's not proven, sometimes if they're well-written rejects or well-written revise and resubmits, they'll take you through those possible disconnects between claims and evidence. For example, if we do the Rage on Pages of Rage, which is, hey, you can't make an audience reaction argument out of an analysis of the textual things themselves. So that's a really helpful thing to say, which is you can make all kinds of great arguments from this really interesting data, but not this one. Is the answer to get more evidence, that I think there's a gap in this evidence and you need to close that gap, but otherwise the evidence is solid? Or do you need to change the argument? A lot of the criticism is about structure, which is you have written a piece that you are very familiar with and you know why it's structured this way, but you need to make that architecture clear to the reader. And that is something that's often very, very important, which is that there's a kind of confusing, you need signpostings, you need transitions. And I know that it sometimes feels workaday, yeoman-like to offer an overview of the structure of the argument in the beginning, but depending on how intuitively your argument flows, it's very helpful to say, I'm going to present this, this, and this is how these pieces interlock, and do that early, maybe even before your literature review. And then there's criticism of writing. Sometimes this is the toughest. When I talk to authors, this is the part that wounds the most, but this is often the kind that's easiest to fix. Verb tense or sloppy sentences or those kinds of things. They are the easiest ones to fix. Sometimes you'll get, there's missing literature, and this can range from the crucial, hey, you miss that someone made this exact same argument on this exact same subject, which again, I still believe that literature is your friend and helps you sharpen. But if you didn't acknowledge it and it's in the piece, that can be a real problem. It can be the substantial, you need to add these works. If you don't consider this element of this argument, then your pieces, it's going to be a gap in this. And there is an issue, right? If you're writing about a subject that someone or multiple someones have written really important books on, then it's important to cite those and tell how you slot amongst them. Then you get my book is not cited, which happens sometimes, but that is really, unless the book is one of the major ones on the theme, on the field, as an editor, I recognize the peevishness of that. And you may want to address it, but it's not necessarily dispositive of publishing a piece. And so this is one of the questions that if you get the questions about literature, it is, have I framed this correctly? Have I really been citing, have I been unclear? And I'm citing so many things about my subject. I'm not citing enough stuff that really highlights my argument. They are not asking you necessarily to just put things in footnotes, to add citations to books that you either read and didn't put in there or that you need to. Now, occasionally occasionally there are people who say you simply cannot write a piece about this without citing X, Y, and Z. And so maybe you should cite them. But by and large, what they're asking you when they're pushing you to engage the literature more is to give a better frame to the argument that you're making. Highlight which literature is impacting your argument, not just your subject. But, and I say this a lot to authors I talk to, sometimes readers are trying to get you to write a different piece that you do not want to write, or they're wanting to write a piece that you know you can't write because the sources aren't there, and that's not the argument you want to make. That's not the subject that you're trying to cover. And you have every right to refuse this. And even if you do, it does not necessarily mean this venue is closed. It could mean that, depending on the editor and the reader. But we have quite often just had it today, talk to an author who had a reader who said, I don't like this, and wrote a very extensive reject letter that went on for almost 50 pages, which was, some had citations and things in there, which is a very careful rejection of the piece. And this author was kind of blown back and said, well, what do I do with this? I don't think this person will ever be happy with what I write. And the answer is, that's probably true. But as an editor, this kind of reject is incredibly valuable. This reader spent a lot of time going through and looking and really thinking about this person's argument. And it might be that this person, for whatever reason, is deeply invested in not seeing this published. But the criticism they're giving is incredibly valuable. And if the reader responds to those parts of that report that they think are valuable, that they did have a point here, they did have a point there, but on these other things, I can't do that, or I wouldn't do that, then it's fine for that author to say, I took some of this, I didn't make all these changes. And even if we send it back as part of revise and resubmit to that author who says, that reader says, I still don't want you to publish it, I still think you can reject it, we may publish it because we recognize this is a reader that's never going to come around, but their criticism between the first version and the second version, 60% of them are answered, and what remains are things where I can see that there's not a good match between a reader and an author, but that doesn't mean that the piece shouldn't be published, because this piece and all these pieces you publish, they're yours. If you didn't write the piece that they would have written, that's okay. There are times where readers will suggest entirely complete overhauls, entirely new research agendas, things that you don't want to go. Don't be aware to them. Don't be aware of them, but don't be overwhelmed. Because reader 4 doesn't like it, well, maybe reader 4 just has a different vision on how this would work. Some readers will never come around. But you need to be open to where your readers are pointing out real issues, real weaknesses, real problems of reframing or structure or argument, or how you need to use the literature, where you need to place this argument, and be honest with yourself about what is your piece's engine, what are the arguments it's making, what can you make with the evidence base that you have, then make sure your argument is specific, not implied, not because that's the title of the piece. And there are lots of venues and lots of opportunities for good work. These articles, particularly with an analytical edge, can be made, again, quickly is a relative word for historians, but they can be made sharply and don't have to sprawl. They don't have to be only pulled out of your dissertation. And there are lots of venues, depending on how you want to set up your questions and your data. There are lots of places that they can go, whether it's at the JH or any of the other really great journals that we have publishing work. So hopefully that's a very broad and very quick overview. Happy to take any questions, happy to talk about it more. If there's anything in particular I can answer, please let me know. Beth?
Steve, could you maybe give our attendees just a quick idea of what it looks like once they submit something, like you talked a
Sure.
little bit about you send it out for to readers and you get
Yeah.
reports back, but like sort of like what are you talking about timeline there? If it gets accepted, what's the timeline to publication?
When we get a piece in, we have an internal editorial committee that will read everything that comes in. I read every piece that comes over the transom, and everyone in our committee does. We would then, within about 2 weeks, we'll make a decision about whether it's going out to readers or whether it's not. So if it's not going out to readers, you should know within 3 weeks or so of submitting something. If it goes out to readers, we have a list of readers. We will ask them to read it. We give them all 1 month to read it. So now you're adding a month onto the 2 weeks that we had it in-house. So now you're knocking on 2 months. Now that's if it goes quickly. And if they get back to us there are times where we can get back to you, you submit something and we get an answer, a revise and resubmit, or even an accept within 6 months. Sometimes though, it is difficult to find readers. This was particularly rough lately, well, coming out of the pandemic, that people understandably were doing other things and not reading things, or readers fall apart, or readers they just don't follow through. So sometimes that can take a little more than the optimal month. And then when you get pieces in, we get them in house and read the readers' reports and formulate. Sometimes there's an editorial meeting and then that comes back out. So, 6 months, 7 months. And then sometimes at that point, they might go out for a revise and resubmit. When they come back into a revise and resubmit, they are turned around much quicker. We read them in-house, but they move much more quicker back out to readers if it looks like the author has made a good faith effort of doing what was asked in the revision letter. We check it against the revision letter, but those come out, and again, it's 1 more month and then we make a decision. When things are accepted, right now, if we accepted something, we would be putting it about not quite a year out, right about a year out. So if we accepted something today, we accepted something yesterday, and I think it's going to go into the December or March issue of 25. So that's our schedule. We're normally about, from acceptance to when it shows up in the press, is about in the journal, it's about a year, maybe a year and 1 more issue.
Thank you, Steve. We have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any advice for graduate students or emerging scholars who completed their degree via exams and want to create an article that is based off non-dissertation papers and research?
Sure. Yeah, so I don't know whether that we actually publish a lot of things that are graduate student writing. I mean, I don't think that, so it's a question that you have you have pieces of writing that were not a dissertation. Can those be turned into articles? Is that right?
I'm
Yeah.
assuming that is it.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, so I think, so if that's not the question, just let me know what the question is. Yeah, those are actually much easier. In some cases, it is an easier transition to have a discrete paper that's making covering a smaller, in some ways, the size of a seminar paper is probably easier to turn into an article than a dissertation, because the dissertation is often constructed that it's so big that when you take an article out of it, it's very clear that this is not meant to stand on its own. Now, they can be, depending on how your dissertation is set up. So yeah, no, there's absolutely no problem. The problem is once you have a piece of writing that was not written necessarily led by an argument. If it was led by an argument, then you might be very close to having an article that's ready to be submitted, really. But a lot of times what you have is you were led to do a body of research and write up a narrative, but it's really not analytically sharp, that the argument feels a little bit tacked on, as we talked about. And so those things, sometimes the easiest way is to not think about the paper that you wrote and turning that into an article, but instead thinking of the research that you did and the data you accumulated, and then what is the analytical edge that comes out of that material. So there are times in which attempting to take a 40-page paper you wrote for a class and turning it into an article is more less successful work than instead essentially melting all of that down to what's the material in there and thinking about what kind of real sharp analytical argument you can make out of that. And then building it back up rather than trying to retrofit a piece and keep all of the paragraphs you've already written. Does that make sense, Beth?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So thank you, Steve, for being here today. This was incredibly informative. As somebody who herself has worked with the journal, I learned a ton. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that you never know. Um, so again, thank you. Thank you, Steve, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.